Let's talk about the quality of beer. And you start to judge the beer as soon as you see the package, whether it's a bottle or a can, or perhaps the font on top of the bar. You're starting to make decisions about that beer straight away, assuming you're going to pour it into a glass, and I urge you to do that, and I'll explain why in due course. You're going to see the foam. Now, I've done a lot of work on foam over the years, and I can tell you absolutely that even those people who confess to drinking the beer straight out of the container, if they see a beer, they think it's better if it's got a foam on it. You don't want too much foaming. That's when the beer helps itself out of the container. You open the container and it zooms out. That's called gushing. We don't want that because we don't want our beer on the floor or on a surface. We want it in the glass. The clarity. It's a difficult subject to talk about these days. Over the years, throughout my career in the brewing industry, starting in 1978, I've insisted for most beers, one or two exceptions like Hefeweizen, but most beers should be bright. In other words, not cloudy. The world's a different place nowadays, and there's lots of cloudy beer, and people seem to think it's somehow better. And if that's what they think, that's okay. The colour, you're influenced by the colour of the product. So all those things, before you even smelt it or tasted it, they're going to influence your perception of the flavour. And the other thing is that that flavour will change with time. Indeed, the appearance will change with time. It's called instability. So the product is continually changing. It's usually in a way that you don't want. When we talked about barley wines, I said it may be in a beneficial direction, but for most beers it's downhill. And last, but certainly not least, we don't want the product to do us any harm, and we would like to think it might do us some good. So issues of safety and wholesomeness, we will address those in a later lecture. So let's start talking about the package itself. And let's say we've got a bottle. Now, the bottles, depending on where you are in the world, they may be one trip or they may be returnable. A one-trip bottle is used when a brewery uses new glass every time. So the bottles come in new, they're washed, and they're filled. Returnable glass is a glass where the bottle comes back, having previously been used, it comes back to the brewery and is cleaned out and washed and then filled again. And you can tell, because there are scuff marks on the returnable glass. Every time the bottles go down the line, they rub against one another and they leave white marks around. These are called scuff marks. In the United States, it's pretty much entirely one-trip glass. North of the border, actually, there's returnable glass. And the one-trip glass looks better. Now, people say to me, well, surely it's more environmentally friendly to use returnable glass. Well, not necessarily so, because remember, you've got to sort them out. So the bottles come back to the brewery, and they may be a mixture of bottles, different colours, different shapes. They've got to be sorted. And then just imagine yourself in a bar. You've got a glass, you've got your beer, you pour it out, and you're eating a bag of chips. So you eat the chips. And what are you going to do with the bag? You're going to be talking to somebody, you're going to fold it up, and you're going to pop it in the bottle. Please don't do that. Somebody's got to get it out again if it's a piece of returnable glass. So the very appearance of that bottle is going to give you some sort of thinking going on about, well, I wonder what it's going to taste like inside. And if it's got scuff marks on it, it looks a bit older. The labels, they've got to be on true. They've got to be right, square, laid on the way they need to be. And the more labels the brewer has to put on, and marketing people are always wanting some more complexity. There's a front label, there's a back label, there's a neck label. All of that has to be done properly. Because if something isn't put on right or it peels off, it's a problem. I remember being in a senior executive's house one time and he gave me a beer and I didn't put it in a glass. I was holding the beer and it came straight out of an ice bucket and I'm holding the beer and the label is sliding off. And the label's sliding towards me and the beer is heading towards my host on the other side of the kitchen counter. Not a good idea. The labels have got to be put on properly and stay there in shape. It's always going to influence the quality. Imagine, if you will, you're going into a supermarket and you buy a can of peas or want to buy a can of peas and there's two of them left on the supermarket shelf. One of them's great, it's in pristine condition. The other one's got a dent in it. Which one are you going to buy? It's the one that's not got a little dent in it. You know the product inside is going to be fine. The same thing applies for beer. If it doesn't look right, it isn't right. It's got to be done properly. It's going to influence your judgment. Cans. As I will tell you later in this course, beer is more stable in a can than it is in a bottle. It lasts longer in a can than it does in a bottle. I was in a bar one time with my wife, or a restaurant, and this woman asked me what I wanted to drink. And I ordered a beer and along it came in a can. And I sort of went, oh. And my wife said, what's the problem? You keep telling people beer's better in a can. And I say, yes, but a can doesn't look right in a restaurant. So it's a psychological thing. People are influenced by what the container looks like, what it feels like. If you're having beer on tap, you look at the font. Is the font fun? Is it exciting? Is it informative? And dare I say it, if it's a beer that comes from the big guys, and you know it is, there are some people who psychologically prefer not to buy beer that's brewed by large brewing companies. No matter what the quality of the beer is like, they psychologically have a block on that. And then, as I say, I prefer that you put it in a glass. Not compulsory, but I think you'll benefit from having the beer in a glass. And people say, what is the correct glass? And I say, it's the one that's not got the wrong name on it. The number of times I've had beers that are clearly Pilsner-type beers served into Guinness glasses is beyond measure. You've got to put it in the correct glass. And that's why they do it so well in Belgium. I was in a friend's house once in Antwerp. He was in his home. And he asked me if I wanted a beer, which is a strange question. I said, yes, please. And I chose a beer, and he went away. And 15 minutes later, I said, Guido, where's my beer? And he said, I'm trying to find the glass. And it's in his own home. And he wanted to have the correct glass for that beer. That is reverence. The correct logo, not the wrong logo. It's all celebrating the beer. So I'm here at Mills River, and I want to talk to you about bubbles, talk to you about foam. I do urge you to pour your beer into a glass, because then you get a full appreciation of the appearance of that beer. And foam is more complicated than you think it is, or think it might be. If you pour ever so gently, like this, you're not going to produce the bubbles. There's a lot of carbon dioxide in beer, but if you don't release it, if you don't allow it to come out of the beer, you're not going to make bubbles. So I'll show you momentarily how to pour a beer, and you've got to pour it with a degree of vigor. Also, you can have, perhaps in the glass, deliberately etched bottoms to the glass and locations where the bubbles will be produced. We call them nucleation sites. And what you get is a stream of bubbles rising through the beer. And they're replenishing the foam the whole time. We call it beading. This is not only putting more bubbles into the head, but it looks good. It makes the beer look lively and appealing and attractive. Now, you can get beverages that have got lots of carbon dioxide in them that will give you lots of bubbles produced, but those bubbles won't survive. They collapse. Champagne, a lot of effervescence, but there's no stable foam on the top of the drink. So why do you get a stable foam on beer? And that is because there are materials in the beer which hold the bubble wall together. And they are proteins, and they come from the cereal, from the barley, even better from the wheat. Wheat gives really good proteins, but also the bitter molecules, the things from the hops that give the bitterness. So what happens when you pour your beer is the protein and the bitterness sticks together in the bubble wall and holds it together. Now, the next time you pour out a beer, and I'm going to do that any minute now, the next time you pour a beer, don't start drinking it straight away. Pause a while. Look at the foam. And it's going to go from being relatively wet to much more solid. It's going to stiffen. And now, when you drink the beer, and you only drink it from one side of the glass, what you're going to get is this foam sticking to the side of the beer glass. We call it cling or lacing. I'm known to call it cathedral windows of foam. So appealing to most people. But also the interesting thing about foam is it can have different textures. You might have a beer which gives you a foam that is quite lacy and quite fine, but you can have foams which are much more dense. And a classic, of course, is a Guinness foam with those tiny white bubbles. And the foam might pick up color as well. Some foams are very, very white, but you can have some that give you a darker color because they're picking up some of the color molecules as the foam is produced. So how do you pour a beer? I've told you how not to pour a beer, but how do you pour a beer? So let's take this fine product here, Torpedo, and let's take a glass. The important thing, as we've said, is the right glass, so the right name on the glass. And if you look at this glass, it's actually got a hop in the bottom. There's the image of a hop. It's not for decorative purposes. It's down there at the bottom, so you can't see it. But what that is a nucleation system. And what's going to happen is that's etched into the bottom of the glass. And bubbles are going to rise, this beading phenomenon, from that particular location and replenish the foam and give you this very attractive rising of the bubbles. So the important thing is turn the bottle so the other people can admire your selection and take the top off. This is not the most user-friendly opener, but there we are, we've succeeded. Raise the glass, raise the bottle, put them at an angle and pour with vigor. Allow the foam to stream, or the beer to stream down the side of the glass and produce this beautiful foam. Time it properly so that the last drop coincides just with the foam at the top of the glass. And you can see this beautiful foam, and it's wet and it's liquid, but as I stand here, it's solidifying. You can see it stiffening. This beautiful, attractive, you can see the bubbles rising through that beer, replenishing the foam the whole time, this beading phenomenon. So you've got this beautiful color, which we'll talk about momentarily. You've got the clarity of this product, which I personally like very much. And you can see this wonderful stiff foam, one of the most beautiful things that humankind has ever been exposed to. Now, it's got to be a clean glass. So here's what you've got to do. You've got to avoid there being any detergent or any grease or any oils and fats, food materials on that glass. So you've got to wash the glass properly. I personally am not a fan of washing glasses in machines because you're not sure whether your dishwasher is going to leave some residue at the end of the day. So, kitchen, sink, hot water, washing up detergent, and do the glasses first. You don't put anything else in there, no plates, no greasy plates, nothing like that. Because they are going to give you the increased chance of materials being left on the glass which will smear the glass and cause problems for the foam. So you wash with the detergent inside and out, and then slowly trickling water, you wash away the detergent inside the glass, outside the glass. You will let them drain dry. Best not to dry them on a cloth because there may be some grease on that cloth. And there's always the chance that your fingers will make contact with the glass. And there's oils and sliminess on your fingers. You don't want that in the glass. Never carry glasses with your fingers in there. That's a terrible, terrible idea. So now you've got a clean glass. And you can make sure and test for cleanliness. Take your glass, take one of the glasses you've cleaned, wet the inside, and sprinkle salt all over the inside of the glass. And if there's a greasy spot, then the salt won't stick to that location. If you've got an even coating of salt over the inside of the glass, it's clean. One way to know if you've got a greasy glass, a dirty glass, is if somebody gives you that glass with beer in it, you might see ugly bubbles on the inside of the glass within the body of the beer. In the body of the beer, you'll see these big ugly bubbles at the side. That is a greasy spot. And if I may dare to make a recommendation, mustaches are not good for foam because grease from the mustaches is going to drip into the foam and kill it. Your call. Lipstick has the same effect. You can see the lacing on the side of the glass. Isn't that the most sublime and beautiful thing? You can take it too far. Sometimes you can open a bottle of beer and you don't have to pour with vigor because the beer is going to zoom out of the bottle. We call that gushing. And that is highly undesirable. It incurs high levels of cleaning costs for your pants, and you get less beer because it's deposited itself on your clothing and not in the glass, which is where you want it. Gushing can be caused by a glass or a bottle or a can being agitated. You drop it accidentally, you pick it up, open it, gushing. Or you may have a stupid friend who thinks it's highly amusing. But you can get gushing caused by materials that find their way into the beer. We talked about nucleation sites. So if you've got anything, maybe a particle. I've had beer that came out of bottles that had not been properly washed, and there were tiny slivers of glass. And this was not in America. Tiny slivers of glass in unwashed bottles that caused this gushing. The biggest problem is material that comes from contaminated grain. If you have barley that is grown in wet, cold places, there is a risk that that grain can be contaminated with a mold called fusarium. And that mold produces a material which causes gushing. And the only solution is don't use contaminated grain. The chances of that happening in most parts of the world are remote, but it can happen, and you've got to caution yourselves against using less than perfect malt. So the foam is critical, but there are other criteria for appearance as well. So we've talked about the foam. The next thing you're going to see, if you've got your beer in a glass, is the color of that beer. And so you can have beers that are very light in color through to progressively dark. So let's take a look at this. This is Otrevez. This is the Gosa from Sierra Nevada. And what you're going to see in this beer is that it is very, very pale color, a very light color. And that's because it is produced with a very lightly dried malt. It's very, very pale in color because it's not been particularly heavily heated. Compare and contrast that with the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which of course uses quite a lot of pale ale malt, as opposed to, say, a Pilsner malt. Also, it's got some of the malts, the caramelized malts, crystal caramel malt. So it's going to have a darker color. It's going to be more of a richer amber color. Of course, then we can have beers like this stout, which contains significant levels of more heavily roasted grain. So you're going to have chocolate malt, black malt, and roasted barley. So now you're going to have an intense darkness in this product. Just to say again, the main malt in either the pale ale or indeed the stout is the same pale malt which contains those enzymes that are so important to the brewer. But the specialty malt mix is different. This has got the caramelized malts. This has got the roasted malts and barley in that particular product. Years ago, we did a study at the brewery in Bass when I was a research manager of Bass, and we took a beer with a color like that and we made it look like that by adding a flavorless dye, a dye stuff, a cooking material, cooking dye that didn't have any flavor. We just changed the color. And when we gave the product to people to taste, the same beer but with different colors, people said they tasted different. People drink with their eyes. So the next thing you're going to notice is the haze, the clarity of the product. Some beers are relatively bright. Some beers are cloudy. A bright beer, a good example would be this. You can see that it is very, very clean in terms of the eyes, a very clear product. But some beers are more turbid. And of course, for the longest time, for all time, the Hefeweizen, Hefe meaning yeast, Weizen meaning wheat or white, is turbid. And that's because it contains yeast that's suspended there, and also some proteinaceous material that comes from the wheat. So a Hefeweizen is going to be relatively turbid. It's certainly more cloudy than this one, but not as cloudy as this one. So this is the East Coast IPA style, the deliberately cloudy beer. This is, of course, Hazy Little Thing. And Hazy Little Thing is deliberately turbid. So compare and contrast that with that, you can see how we have this turbidity, haze, whatever you want to call it, a lack of clarity. And that is what it's supposed to look like. And that's okay. People love the appearance of cloudy beers in this day and age. So although I've been in the industry for 40 years and for the longest time been telling people the importance of clarity for most beers, I have to accept the fact and go along with the fact that beers may need to be turbid because that is part of the style. And what the brewer needs to do is be true to the style. And to be true to the style for a thing like Hazy Little Thing, it needs to be consistently hazy. I say again, it's harder to do that consistently. That is the way of the world, and that speaks to the skill of the brewer. The last thing I'd like to talk about in terms of the appearance of beer, and I touched upon the importance of the glass earlier on, is the shape of the glass. And of course, there are a great many shapes of glasses. Hefeweizen, of course, classically is in that almost like a tulip-shaped glass. Then you have the Pilsner glass, which is kind of gently curved. You have Snifter, which is a bit more like a brandy glass. You have tulip glasses, okay? Which are not like the Hefeweizen type of tulip, but just the top part of it. You have the goblet. You have the classic, is it classic? But the shaker glass, the classic pint glass that you get in the United States. The imperial glass. You have Nonic, you have tankards, and so on. And people say, well, it's important to have the right shape of glass for a certain type of beer. I don't think there's good evidence for that. I do think there's good evidence for the importance of having the correct glass in terms of labeling, and many beer styles are associated with a certain shape of glass, like a Hefeweizen glass, or the glasses that you will be served in Trappist beer in. I think it's important. The label is particularly important, but do they influence the flavor? I'm not sure there's good evidence for that. We'll talk about flavor in the next lecture. Whether it's influenced by the precise shape of the glass, I doubt it. Well, people say, oh, it does, but if you're not doing a blind taste and you're seeing what the beer is, just like the foam and the clarity and the colour are going to influence your judgment on the flavour of the beer, so too is the shape of the glass. And I'm not convinced that anybody has got really good evidence that different shapes of glass truly do influence the flavour. It is psychological. It's a beautiful thing. I'm a great fan for celebrating beer, great fan of celebrating beer. And I think telling stories about the glass and the shape of the glass and the label are wonderful things. I think they're wonderful things. But whether they have a genuine influence on the flavour of the beer, I fear I very much doubt that. So, we've talked a great deal about the appearance of the beer and the importance of that, right the way through from the package, right the way through to the glass, on people's interpretation of beer quality. Now we will turn to the direct matters to do with the flavour of beer.